Okay, so I think we'll get started again. I'm Hiroshi Motomura, Faculty Co-Director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy. And thanks to all of you who've been with us this morning and also were around with us midday Pacific at least, to hear the conversation between my Faculty Co-Director, Ahilan Arulanantham, and DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. A huge part of what we want to do at this center, at this conference, and indeed on the panel it's about to start, is to ask questions, to instigate conversations that might, and often are, maybe hopefully are challenging, but reflect an honest and hopefully generative debate. And the dialogue with Senator Mayorkas is a prime example. And we'll welcome U.S. Senator Alex Padilla to day 3 of this conference in a week for another dialogue. But what I'd like to do right now is to start our afternoon panel on asylum, and I'll start up by introducing your moderator, my friend and UCLA Law School colleague, Tendai Achiume. It's really an honor to introduce you. It's Professor Achiume's engagement with immigration law and policy is both very deep and very broad. She's written very influentially on refugees and several important articles. She's been both an academic leader and an important international voice, international public voice on racism and xenophobia, in particular, but not only, as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism and racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Another thing I want to mention, in case you don't know about this, is I think one of her most significant thought interventions of late, and I would add so far, is her article in the Stanford Law Review, Migration is Decolonization, which is an instant classic. And one reason it's instant classic is that it's boundary breaking. It's no accident that Tendai's work isn't just work that we want to claim in the Center on Immigration Law and Policy, but it's also work that's central to the UCLA School of Law's Promise Institute for Human Rights, where Tendai has served as faculty director. One of the key questions for the future of migration and government responses and people's responses to migration is the relationships that there are between, or among, I should say, civil rights, immigrants' rights, and human rights. And so all of this makes Tendai a perfect moderator for this conversation this afternoon. So thank you, Tendai, for leading us for the afternoon panel, and I'd like to hand the microphone over to you.
Thanks so much, Hiroshi, for that really generous introduction. And I could go on and on about how so much of the work I'm able to do as a result of your mentorship, but I'll hold off of the soppy tears that would follow and transition to the task of moderating this amazing panel. I want to start off by just saying that I'm joining you from Los Angeles and want to acknowledge my presence and also UCLA's existence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. And having done that, I also just want to welcome everyone who's joining us for this panel, the final panel of the day. So today, the theme of our panel is asylum and other humanitarian protections, the short and the long term. And as the panel description notes, no issue has received more attention than the Biden administration's policy towards people who are seeking asylum and other forms of humanitarian protection, particularly at the southern border. It's really a privilege to introduce our 3 speakers today, and I'm really going to be limiting how much I'm saying because the 3 of them are just such depths of profound knowledge on the topics that we're going to be focusing on. We're really lucky to have them with us. And what we're going to be discussing broadly is thinking about the Biden administration's actions so far, what a just and humane asylum system would look like, and what needs to change to create a just and asylum system. And so joining us today are Guerline Jozef, Jaya Ramji Najalis, and Erica Pinheiro. I'm just going to read very brief bios of theirs and encourage you to look up each and every one of them because they bring to this conversation profound expertise on the topics that we're going to be talking about. So Guerline Jozef is the co-founder and executive director of the Haitian Bridge Alliance, which assists thousands of Haitian and other migrants who've endured dangerous journeys from their native countries and who are trying to reach the US. And among other things, she's also the co-director of Faith in Action and Immigration Justice movement in Southern California, a 4-part immigration program for both impacted communities and their allies. We also have Jaya Ramji Nogales, who's Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the I. Herman Stern Research Professor at Temple University, Beasley School of Law, where she teaches refugee law and policy and supervises the Temple Asylum project. And among the many other things she's working on, her current work assesses refugee law under the Trump administration. And then we are also joined by Erica Pinheiro, who's the Litigation and Policy Director of the Direct Legal Services nonprofit Al Otro Lado. In this capacity, she leads her organization's efforts in filing class action lawsuits challenging policies that restrict access to asylum, to the US asylum system. And in addition to that, she also provides on-the-ground context regarding US border policies to the White House, to state attorneys general, and to members of Congress as well. Before beginning, I want to say a word about the panel format. So we agreed that the panel format would be a conversation structured around a series of questions and themes that I'll be posing to the panelists. And what we decided is that rather than save questions from the audience till the end, we'd like you to begin populating the Q&A from the beginning. So for participants, I think you may not be able to see other people's questions, but you should be able to see the Q&A box. So please begin populating that box with your questions from the very beginning. And what I will be doing is interjecting with your questions as we proceed with the conversation. So don't hold back. I'm going to jump right in and say that we thought we'd begin this conversation by grounding our conversation in a description of the situation or the current reality at the southern border, because too often conversations about law and policy, including or especially on asylum and humanitarian protection, can begin on the basis of false assumptions. And I'm going to pose this question first to Erica before turning to the other panelists to ask, could you give us a picture of what's happening at the southern border? And specifically, can you talk to us about how what's happening is maybe different from what was happening before under the Trump administration, how it's the same, and also kind of touch on how you think the reality differs from widely held assumptions about about what people think is going on. We'd really appreciate your just giving us a sense of the situation as it stands.
Sure. First, I just want to thank everyone for inviting me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be with my co-panelists and our amazing moderator today. So that being said, I can say I'm here in Tijuana, and I've been living here through the Trump administration and now through the beginning of the Biden administration. And conditions here are worse than I've ever seen them, including worse than they were under the Trump administration. So one indication of that is the fact that thousands of parents are choosing to separate themselves from their children. They're choosing to send their children ahead because unaccompanied children are some of the only individuals who have access to the US asylum system. And the reason why they're sending their children is because the conditions on the ground here have become so untenable. So first, the shelter system is completely overwhelmed, principally because of the Biden administration's use of Title 42 expulsions. We used to have a COVID filter system here on the border where migrants would go into a COVID filter hotel before going to shelters. That's completely broken down because of the expulsions. So now we're seeing COVID spread in shelters. The shelter system's overwhelmed. So that's forcing people into dangerous border camps where they're completely exposed, not only to the elements, but to exploitation by criminal groups. Because there's no legal way to seek asylum, people are forced to work with smugglers. We've heard horrifying stories of smugglers kidnapping, extorting, trafficking, raping our clients. And humanitarian workers and attorneys have also received threats from criminal groups here on the border. I do want to say a word about how Title 42 is being implemented, because I heard Secretary Mayorkas's comments earlier about his justification for using Title 42 is that they don't want to keep migrants in congregate settings. That could not be further from the truth of what is happening. They absolutely are keeping migrants in congregate settings. For example, the lateral flights I mentioned refer to flights that are going from the Rio Grande Valley and dropping migrants off in San Diego and El Paso from which they are expelled to Mexico. So when they're being staged for that flights, they're kept in the Donna tent facility, which holds thousands of migrants in a congregate setting. They're held for up to a week. We also know of migrants who've been held for up to a month before they're expelled. So this is really creating a lot of chaos on the border. And one big misconception is that the chaos is being caused by too many people coming to the border. That's not true. We're not seeing more new arrivals than we did under the Obama administration, and certainly not more than we were seeing under the Trump administration. What's happening is that there's a backlog because access to the US asylum system is completely shut down. So you see the same people crossing over and over again, trying to escape the hellish conditions that they're living in Mexico. And the last thing I'll mention, and I really want my colleague Guerline to talk more about this, is how Black migrants are really disproportionately affected by these policies. I'll definitely let her get into more detail, but just very quickly say that, they've been waiting here the longest. They've been here for years, waiting for access to the US asylum system because they were metered since the Obama administration. Metering means they cut off restricted access at ports of entry to create essentially a waiting list in Mexico. Black migrants have been on those lists for years. And while they're waiting, they face extreme discrimination and abuse in Mexico. And now they're being expelled to countries like Haiti and Jamaica without getting any chance to seek protection.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you, Special Reporter Tingai, for really having us here today. And as you heard from Erica, that is the reality at the US-Mexico border. And when we speak specifically about Black migrants, what we are seeing is that, as I mentioned many times before, that when we travel in these Black bodies of ours, there's no way for us to escape. There's no way for us to hide. The moment a migrant from Haiti, from Jamaica, from Cameroon, from Mauritania set foot in Mexico, they are targeted. Unlike, our community members from Guatemala, from Honduras, who are non-Afro descendant ones, they can blend in when they get to Mexico. But for Black migrants, that does not exist. And as you heard Erica mentioned, the majority of those Black migrants from Haiti have been at the US-Mexico border since under President Obama, who they end up in the metering system that nobody wants to take ownership of. Not the Mexican government, not the US government wants to take ownership of the metering system that was created specifically when Black migrants started arriving at the US-Mexico border. So now we are seeing the use of Title 42 as a trap, literally a trap for the majority of those people. When we see people who made the journey, and I can go back and tell you that those people are survivors of the earthquake that happened in Haiti in 2010, killing over 250,000 people, leaving the country in complete shambles. And those people migrated to Chile, to Brazil, and where they in turn had to deal with anti-Black racism and all of those different things that keep on pushing them to make this journey, crossing the entire South and Central America to come to the US-Mexico border to ask for asylum. And what we are seeing, there are two reports that came out this past couple of months. One is called the Invisible Wall, where we talk about how Title 42 has been used as a wall, invisible wall, to trap those people, deport them, and expel them. And then we have the new report that you are going to also be seeing, how we have records and testimony from people, as Erica mentioned, who have been raped, kidnapped, and really being mistreated at the US-Mexico border. As a matter of fact, just last week, one of our coordinators got got stopped at gunpoint because they robbed him. So that is the reality that we are seeing at the US-Mexico border, and we are asking for Title 42 to be rescinded. There are no health reasons why Title 42 should continue to exist, especially when we are hearing right now how they are opening, the baseball games and the movie theaters, and we don't have to wear masks outside anymore. So we are trying to see what are the reasons why they will continue to put people's lives in danger under the guise of Title 42. So what we are seeing at the US-Mexico border is not a crisis. It is the fact that we are seeing a bottleneck where there is no other way for people to safely and humanly access the asylum system, which is unacceptable. And we see in turn, as you heard from Erica, they are deporting and expelling people to Mexico, to Haiti, to Honduras, and other countries. And what is even worse is when we see pregnant women who finally make it to the United States, they give birth in the United States, in San Diego, then they get deported, they get expelled back to Mexico. Haitian women get expelled back to Mexico with their newborn babies from the United States. And Erica and Alotolado and Haitian Bridge Alliance have to fight to get their birth certificate because they were deported before they could receive the US birth certificate. So what we are seeing at the US-Mexico border right now is unacceptable.
Before I just jump to Jaya, sorry Jaya to interrupt, I wanted to ask you, Guerline, to also reflect a little bit on how we even think about that border. And I know that you and other conversations have spoken about this, about how, you know, to think that the southern border is just the US-Mexico border is a mistake, and that it actually stretches further back. If you could give us a sense of how far south that border stretches even now under the Biden administration, and also give us a sense of who's moving. So you mentioned Haitians who, you know, are fleeing the earthquake, many people who've been waiting for many years. And Erica, please do chime in here as well. But I think it's helpful to not only problematize and clarify what the nature of the crisis is. And it sounds like what you're saying is it's not the numbers of people arriving, it's the system that's in place to respond to arrivals, but also giving people a sense of what it is the border is when we actually talk about it. That I think that would be helpful. And then Jaya, please feel free to jump in.
Yes, and that's what we refer to it as invisible borders. And please understand those borders only exist for people who need protections, for people who are underprivileged. If you are a millionaire, if you have your private plane, if you do not have the confinement of borders. Borders are created to literally, you know, make sure that people who are the most vulnerable do not get protections. So when we talk about the borders, right now we are seeing people getting stopped in Panama. People who have been in the journey that have been stuck at the Panama border for the past 2 years. People getting stopped at the Peruvian border, at the Guatemaltecan borders. Literally along the borders of South and Central America, we see how the US border continues to push further down south. So if they do not have access to continue the journey to Panama, into Colombia, they will not make it to the US-Mexico border. And we are seeing this happening. And one of the most painful stories I heard literally last week is that a person called and said they got shot at. The one woman who got shot from her back, that is in Panama, from her back, and the bullet came from her chest, right? And we are seeing not only those people are getting stuck at different borders, but they are also being extreme vulnerable, as I mentioned, literally getting shot at, getting killed. And we see that as a result of US policies understanding that under former President Trump, over 400 different policies that made it impossible for people to continue the journey. And we see those same policies continues to exist today. As we speak, under President Biden, those policies are still in effect.
So thank you so much to both of you. Thank you to the center for having us today, to Tendai for doing a fabulous job moderating, and you know, Tendai asked me to jump in, but I'd actually just rather listen to Erica and Guerline talk the whole time, because I learned so much from them every time I hear them. So, you know, I think what I'll say is going to be less, you know, straight from the border news to everyone. You know, I'll start by saying Trump, of course, did leave a real mess at the border, but it's a huge disappointment after 100 days that Biden is still using the Title 42 policy. I do want to recommend this report that I'm going to share actually by chat that Erica and Guerline's organization released recently, along with Human Rights First. I think everyone should read it. It talks about actually this serious harm that's happening to everyone at the border who's being pushed back with Title 42. So Title 42, I just want to remind everyone, is just completely illegitimate legally as a basis to send people back. So first of all, under our international legal obligations, under the Refugee Convention, we cannot send people back, right? That's exactly what it says. You cannot refoule people when they arrive at your southern border. If they have an asylum claim, you must assess that asylum claim, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has said as much. But not only under international law, under domestic law, Title 42 is a public health quarantine law from the 1940s that did not envision removal. It has been superseded by the 1980 Refugee Act and by acts implementing the Convention Against Torture and Protections for Unaccompanied Minors. And there's just no public health justification. So when I heard the conversation earlier with Secretary Mayorkas, I didn't have Erica's kind of deeply detailed knowledge of what's happening on the ground, but I just thought it was the congregate setting point didn't make any sense, because public health experts have spoken out so many times and have said, actually what you need to do is ramp up testing at the border. We're not testing at the border right now. We have the capacity to test. We need to expand shelter capacity. We need to set up quarantine and isolation sites, send medical resources to the border. So as I was telling these folks earlier, here in Philadelphia, there was a huge rush yesterday to get people vaccinated because we had 4,000 vaccines that were expiring. Can we send some of those vaccines at the border? Right, we're a very wealthy country that's very capable. So I do think there are a lot of options here, and after 100 days, we should be seeing more action, and we just shouldn't see this illegitimate law in place. And as Erica said, it's just a different form of family separation. We've seen lots of forms of family separation, perhaps the most egregious elicited public outrage, but we should be seeing outrage now that parents are forced to choose between having their children in these very dangerous locations that Erica and Guerline have been talking about, or to send them alone across the border. That's simply inhumane. So I'll skip through detention. I'm happy to talk about it a little more, but there was a whole session on detention the first day. I do want to touch on what Guerline said about where the border is. So one, if we're assessing Biden's record, one deep area of concern that came up recently was his border externalization agreements with Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. These, as Guerline says, are focused on the most vulnerable. What they do is they have immense costs. They make the journey 10 times more expensive financially and just incredibly dangerous. These migrants are now subject to extortion, violence, all kinds of harms on the way north. We're not just talking at the border towns, we're talking all the way north. They're subject to these dangers. And it's the border externalization agreements, the carrier sanctions, right? All of these all of these policies that are creating the problem. And Guerline was saying, right, for the millionaires, right, it's not a problem, even not for the millionaires, even for me. I flew to San Salvador 2 years ago, right? It was super cheap, it was super easy. We're the hypermobile, right? Why is it that people are paying tens of thousands of dollars to take dangerous routes, right? What does that say about us as a nation? What does that say about our policies? What does that say about what we're doing? So that's a deep concern. And I'll just end with one last point. That the thing that I've actually been most disheartened by, and this has come up in previous, Cecilia Wong brought it up the first day of the panel, and Jacinta Gonzalez brought it up this morning, is that I was really hoping for a change in the conversation. I was really hoping that this administration would talk about migrants differently. And of course, we know from Biden's first press conference, he said they should all be going back to Mexico. More recently, Jen Psaki said the objective is to make it more difficult to make the journey. That's not legitimate. That's not, courts have found it's not legitimate to use these policies as deterrents, and making the journey more dangerous has real cost in humans' lives. So we shouldn't, what I had hoped for was not the message you shouldn't come, but the message that these are people fleeing serious harm, or even tied into Biden's climate change message, right, that he's been expounding so effectively, and that we owe our neighbors an obligation to protect them. We owe our neighbors an obligation to treat them with dignity and humanity. And that, as Guerline said already, this is a humanitarian capacity challenge. It's just not a security challenge, right? This is something that we need to pull our resources together and we can do. Or even if they don't want to go there, just say, we're not going to stop them from moving, and stricter border enforcement just makes their journeys more dangerous. But the administration hasn't even gone there. So I will say that that part of it has been a real disappointment.
Thanks, Jay. And your final point, I think, is a really important one in terms of thinking about what's different and what's the same at the border. Part of what's important to focus on is the discourse and the framing and how we actually think about the situation. And Erica and Guerline, I also really appreciate the ways in which you've highlighted really complexifying the nature of the border, where it is, how it exists, its gendered and racial and class dimensions, which I think are really essential for making sense of the conversation that we're having. And I want to say that in pushing back against the understanding of how Title 42 is being used, we actually have already a comment from the Q&A. We have Julie Dargis, who's a former UCLA student, saying, thank you very much, because the characterization in the previous panel, she says, is completely at odds with what is taking place at the border. So I want to transition us now to think about the institution of asylum itself in light of the realities that you all have been describing. And I'd like to give you each an opportunity to reflect on the following question. So where does the problem lie? Is it with the legal and policy institution of asylum and the different forms of humanitarian protection that we have, including the ones that are being adopted and modified by the Biden administration? Or is it about enforcement? Is it that the institutions and the mechanisms and the policies are fine, but what we're seeing is that the way that they're being enforced is problematic? And it's possible that it's a combination of both. It's possible that it's more one than the other. But could you reflect on how we should be understanding the institution of asylum and temporary protection in light of the problems and challenges that you've been describing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to jump in on that one and look forward to hearing what my co-panelists have to say about it. So I think it's a combination. What I'll start by saying is that asylum law, first of all, is part and parcel of our global system of deep inequality, right? Thinking about colonialism tonight, which you talk about so thoughtfully, capitalist intervention, right? Asylum is part and parcel of that system, and it was also really created to address problems in and around World War II, and asylum law just can't manage all of this on its own. It's too old, it's too narrow, right? It's not set up to address what we're seeing now. And maybe I'll talk a little bit before I dive into some more legal analysis, just talk a little bit about Erica and Guerline, who painted a helpful picture, I think, of who's moving, but just to say that the reasons that people move are just incredibly complex. So one example that I'll give is subsistence smallholding farmers in Central America and Guatemala in particular. So first of all, one thing we see them facing is we see serious climate change impact. So we see right in the dry corridor, serious drought, and so they're not able to grow the crops that they have traditionally grown to make a living, to eat. And then we see more kind of imminent climate change threats, such as the hurricanes Eta and Iota last November, which are much later than hurricanes normally are. It's unusual to have two such forceful hurricanes so late in the season. So that seems attributable to climate change, and obviously just destroyed large swaths of Central America. But those problems are, of course, layered over existing social inequality and government negligence towards rural and poor populations, right? If there was a government program that could then help folks who were in those situations, many of them would be able to stay where they were, but there aren't, right? So these folks are neglected within their own country. And so often many of them have to move to cities, right, to urban areas in order to earn a living, in order to support their families. And there, of course, they live often in neighborhoods that are the less wealthy neighborhoods that are facing gang control, and these gangs are, we know, specifically targeting children. So it's just very difficult for them to lead a sustainable life, and it's all of these reasons, right? All of these complex factors and more that I don't have time to talk about on a panel today that are contributing to their movement. And so asylum law just can't get its little brain around that, right? Asylum law talks about these 5 categories: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group, and it struggles to address the complexity of reality. So, I mean, I guess more to your question, the law itself needs updating, right? So gang claims based on persecution by gangs often aren't successful, right? These should be considered political opinion claims, right? Because gangs act as kind of quasi-governmental entities that control large swaths of territory, as do cartels. That claims based on domestic violence, right? We've seen there's a lot of advocacy around those at the moment. We saw some promising law under Obama, and then a lot of bad law under Trump. So one problem, as I said, is that asylum law is focused on persecution on account of specific narrow categories. The question I ask to that is, shouldn't we be protecting all of those who face serious harm? And shouldn't we, if we're thinking about updating the law, shouldn't we just remove the nexus requirement entirely, right? So that it's just about the level of harm that you're facing, and you don't have to prove I'm facing harm on this ground. I'm facing harm and my government won't protect me. And I deserve protection. But also, asylum law requires people to come to the border to seek protection, right? And there aren't very many ways to get to that border safely, as we discussed before. And so then we see people forced into these dangerous journeys that I just talked about. That's a problem. And we just need other routes, right? So not everyone is coming seeking asylum protection, right? Labor migrants are coming because there are jobs that they fill, and they should have sufficient lawful routes. We should be offering sufficient lawful routes, as many lawful routes as there are job openings that migrants are going to take, right? That we have a system that's extremely dysfunctional. Also, family reunification has long been a fundamental principle of immigration law, and what we're doing is we're tearing families apart all the time. And so this needs to be, right, a grounding principle that drives the law, and the law needs to be updated to make that happen. And then I think there are just bigger picture questions about regional responsibility, right? Who do we owe and what do we owe them? And I know Tendai is going to write on this, is working on this, a project on this, which I'm very excited about. But, we have climate change, which I've talked about. We have the gangs that are now controlling a lot of territory, that were deported, that learned how to be gang members here in the US, and then were deported. Economic exploitation, years and years of it, political interventions, our demand for drugs, right? What do we think is funding the gangs and the cartels? It's the US market for drugs, right? And so thinking about all of these things and thinking about, I think what the two of you were saying before, right? We can't just, shut our borders and say we don't see any of these problems. We created these problems, and we owe our neighbors a responsibility to solve them. We can't just hope that they're going to go away through border enforcement, because they're not, right? And so this is really, I just want to leave with the point that this is really a question about our fundamental obligation to our neighbors, who are often our families, right? Who have family members here in the US, and who we should think of in that way.
Erica, thanks so much, Jaya. And I have comments that tie to what you're saying, and I'll come back to them. But Erica, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in on this question of how we should think about where the problem is. Is it about the actual institution of asylum and kind of humanitarian protection, the different forms that we have, whether it's enforcement, and also to encourage you to maybe compare the US's approach to some of what's happening in Central and South America under the Cartagena Declaration, because there's a way in which we can think of the US's approach to these questions as the only form that is available. But if you could reflect on the general question and anything else that you might like to throw in here.
Sure. And first, I will speak as a practitioner who's done a lot of asylum cases and a lot of cases in detention. Jaya, I was really excited when you suggested getting rid of the nexus requirement, because that would make our lives so much easier in immigration court. But I think having over a decade actually representing asylum seekers and doing these cases, I see asylum as a really narrow exception to an imperialist system that protects hoarded wealth in the first world, right? And I think that's really come into focus living on the border, living in Tijuana. Every time I cross into the US, it's jarring, right? The difference between resources between the two countries. And so that has become very clear to me, but the system itself is just cruel. Just think about asylum, right? We're taking the most traumatized people, putting them in a cage, forcing them to relive their trauma over and over and over again in an adversarial system. And then at the end of it, the asylum protections are so narrow that many people end up with withholding of removal or protection under the Convention Against Torture. Unlike asylum, those types of status don't allow you to petition for your family members. So we're really cementing family separation for people who've already been through an incredible amount of trauma. And just this idea of your trauma as currency that makes you worthy of living in the United States and accessing the resources of the first world, either in the US or Europe, to me is just really sick. It's a sick system just overall. And going through it with the asylum seekers is, obviously I see what it's doing to them, but also for the practitioners, there's just a ton of secondary trauma. And I know those of you who are watching who are immigration attorneys can certainly relate to that. Jaya really put it well about talking about how it's so narrow, and really that the fact that there's such a lack of other options, that there's a broad base of people who are kind of forced through the asylum system, not all of whom would qualify for protection under that system, but that fact is used to discredit the system itself, which I think is incorrect, right? It's not the fault of the people who are forced into it that makes asylum illegitimate, right? It's just, they don't have any other options. But just turning to the Cartagena Declaration. So this is, I think it's, if I'm remembering correctly, 84, this was adopted by some of the other countries in the region. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure of the exact date, but basically it's meant to recognize the particular situation that we're seeing in Central America. We've seen an exodus of millions of people from the region, not just in the past few years of this migrant surge, but throughout decades of civil war in the region, much of which was supported and exacerbated by the US, of course. And so the Cartagena Declaration puts a number of protections in place that, which the US has not adopted, puts a number of protections in place that have expanded protection for Central Americans and other countries in the region. So just for example, it's not just the race, religion, nationality, particular opinion, or political opinion, particular social group that will get you protection. They also recognize protection for people who've been threatened by generalized violence, internal conflict, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order. So what we're seeing in Mexico, which has adopted that declaration, is that the asylum approval rates for Central Americans are in the 75% range for most countries, whereas in the United States, it's more in like the 20 to 30% range. So that's been hugely helpful in terms of helping people access protection. And then other things that I don't think none of the countries are actually respecting are just the idea of not engaging in involuntary return of refugees. And I would say the US is instrumental in ensuring that that right is not respected because of how they've militarized, encouraged militarization of Mexican forces, now Guatemalan forces, to either stop people from moving or send them back to their home countries without a chance to seek asylum. So, I think people should be able to move, right? You shouldn't have to relive your trauma. I just think back to my own family. They are from Portugal. They fled a fascist dictatorship, but they came at a time when registry existed. So you could basically like show up and apply for residence. They didn't have to go through all of that, right? And in our particular case, they were just fleeing general strife. They were fleeing a lack of opportunity. It was complicated, like Jaya said, right? It wasn't just like I was being persecuted by a fascist dictator. It was a number of things, right? But they didn't have to prove themselves through their trauma. They could just move and work and live a dignified life and have the rights because they're European, right? But we don't extend that same courtesy to, especially to our neighbors to the south, but to people from the global south who are seeking protection in the first world.
Mhm. Yeah. And I can add that, as both Jaya and Erica mentioned, what we are seeing even with the Cartagena Declaration on Refugee, and Erica, yes, you're right, November 22nd, 1984, is that what we are seeing, even those people who should be protected are not being protected. And we are seeing, as I mentioned, pushing the border all the way to Padilla, and seen people having to go through the mountains of Colombia, and seeing people, because of all of those different things that are not being respected, having to go to the Darien Passage, which is one of the most dangerous places that anyone can go through, and a lot of lives have been lost in that. But we also hear the messages that are being sent from President Biden and the administration when you say do not come. And when not only you say do not come, then you have the embassy, the US Embassy in Haiti, that translates that message into Haitian Creole. But when you translate that into the native language, it's a different connotation on that. It literally say, we don't want you. While we just put Haiti on a level 4, do not travel, quote unquote, stating that it is an active uprising zone. It is an active war zone, yet you send a message in the language saying do not come. When we understand, when we say those things, we create a system where we can continue to destroy the very lives that we are supposed to protect. When they put those agreements in place, is so that those people who are fleeing whatever they are fleeing, like Erica mentioned with her family, fleeing specific things. Right now we have people fleeing those same ideologies, the same system underground at home, yet we tell them do not come, as if they had a choice whether they want to stay or come. When we speak to a family, a man who has 2 young daughters who finish university, he does not want to leave Haiti. His goal is not to leave Haiti. He is crying on the phone saying, I do not want to leave home. But if I don't, my life, my children's lives will be destroyed. So we are forced to leave. So when we say do not come to what? We really need to look into the message that we put out there when we think we say those things as a deterrent, when the person you are talking to has no other choice. And then when we talk about root causes, when we talk about making sure that those people migrating in their Black bodies most of the time, we are not looking into root causes of what's happening in Haiti. We are not looking into root causes of what's happening in Cameroon. When we talk about climate change, and we are talking about providing assistance for people, what happened to the people from the Bahamas? Where entire islands have been completely destroyed. Today, they're still searching for bodies. Yet, I have yet to hear or see anyone talk about root causes of migration from Bahamas. Now, St. Vincent, which was going on right now with the eruption, no one is really looking into that. So we cannot, as a people, as a country, as a nation, continue those same practices and expect a different outcome.
Thanks a lot, Guerline. And I want to give Jaya and Erica an opportunity to respond, and for all of you to respond to each other, and also perhaps to respond to something else that I want to ask, which is that I think all of your responses have done a really powerful job of highlighting the ways in which the asylum system, the temporary protection system, fail to actually meet the needs and the reality on the ground. And you've also, I think, spoken to different ways in which failures of enforcement also play a part. Could you reflect on or respond to something that I actually think is true, which is that it's not just that the asylum system is failing, but it actually perpetrates injustices in the way that it's designed, right? If you think about temporary protected status and who temporary protected status is afforded, you can tell a story about the discriminatory nature of that particular institution. When you look at, domestic violence or generalized violence being removed from a basis from asylum, the specific national origin groups that are being targeted. When we think about the way that racialized enforcement of asylum law plays itself out, it's not just about failures, but it's about active injustices being perpetrated in the legal vehicles and policy vehicles that kind of we hold close. Do you think that's right? Is that a fair characterization given the different kind of vantage points that you all have? And then something else that I would like you to respond to is, and this is something that I'm going to inhabit the perspective of a different person other than myself and say, in all of your remarks, including relating to my first question, you were resisting the idea that there may be a valid need for the kinds of restrictions that exist right now, whether it's relating to COVID, whether it's questions relating to we actually need these restrictions because otherwise there'll be large numbers of people coming that we won't be able to manage once they arrive in the country. How do you respond to somebody whose concerns are in that camp? So a set of reactions, and I'm inviting you to either respond to mine or actually to just ignore mine and respond to each other. And to the audience, please continue to use the Q&A so that we can integrate your questions as we go.
You asked so many great questions. I'm sure I'm not going to remember them all, but one thing that struck me is just thinking about how the system itself perpetuates injustice. We don't have a humanitarian asylum system. We have a deterrence system, right? And so we see that not only at the US-Mexico border, but further south, as we all mentioned. And I wanted to mention a little bit about that, something that wasn't said in after the first question. It's not just physical barriers. The US has invested in a series of information sharing systems. So like I'll just give an example. We had cases of unaccompanied African minors who they went through Panama, they had their fingerprints taken at the Panamanian border. That information was shared with the United States. When they got to the US border, they were accused of being adults, put into adult detention. These were like 15-year-old kids because they had lied to the Panamanian border guards so that they could cross and get to the United States and seek protection. There's all these ways. It's not just physical barriers. It's like electronic barriers to even keep people from getting to the border. And then once they get there, like CBP, we all know the detention system is set up to deter. It's set up to be torture so that people give up their own claims to asylum. CBP officers specifically and intentionally restrict access to the US asylum system. We had cases where CBP officers were lying to people, telling them there is no asylum. They threatened a woman and forced her to recant her claim to asylum on video and then sent her back to Mexico. There's just like a million examples. Never mind what happens when a person's actually in custody. It's like they're given rotten food. They're in some cases sexually abused, physically abused, verbally abused. It's like, that's not a welcoming system, right? That is a system meant to keep people from accessing protection in the United States. So I think, that point needs to be made really clear when we're thinking about, how do we reform these systems, or how do we get to a better system? I think that we probably can't get there with the same agencies we have in place right now. And I mean, especially when we're thinking about CBP, like, these are the people that ripped children away from their parents, and they're doing things right now that are just as horrible because they don't see asylum seekers as people. How are you going to make them into a humanitarian agency? How are they going to be the welcoming committee for someone who's completely traumatized? So, I mean, I think the agencies need to be abolished for us to get anywhere close to, some kind of humane system. But the entire idea, like I mentioned earlier, of just letting this very narrow set of people in, like they're the only ones who deserve and they have to be the most traumatized, I think just really needs to be revisited. And I don't, it's probably not a popular opinion for an asylum attorney, but like, I do think we need to really consider that first and foremost. Like, what are we doing with the system?
Yeah, I'll dive into so many great questions and thoughts, and I think jumping off from what Erica was saying, and kind of looping back to your question tonight about the injustices within the system. So, right, as I kind of alluded to earlier, right, this is a system that was created from the with in mind the kind of white European male, right, who engages in public dissident acts, right? That's the refugee system that we have, and it just has not successfully adapted, and I don't know whether it can successfully adapt, right, to include women, people with of all gender identities, right, non-binary folks, people of color, and that's exactly where you see the pushback. And I don't think it's any accident that you see the pushback when we start to talk about brown people coming, when you start to talk about women coming, right? I think it is constructed in a way that makes it very difficult to make those changes. And I think in part, right, I just really want to highlight the point that Erica made about humanity, right? So it's really a question of whether our system views these people as humans. And I have to say most of the time it doesn't. And that's the part that's really disturbing, and I think that's the part that we really need to work on together. And I agree with Erica that it's just going to get worse with artificial intelligence, right? And tonight you've obviously been working on this as well, but I have real concerns that right, as we see this border turn into a smart border, we see just more and more race-based exclusion, and I think that's a real concern. I also wanted to touch on your point tonight about right, those who kind of say that we need these restrictions, and I think the argument goes something like that there's a sovereign right to enforce our border, right? This is what a sovereign is. It's an entity that can enforce its border. And I guess my question in response to that would be, at what cost, right? What are the limits in terms of how a sovereign can enforce its border, right? Could a sovereign just shoot everyone who comes to the border, right? Would that be acceptable? I have to hope that would not be acceptable to the majority of Americans. But if we understand, right, if people really understand the unbelievable harms that people face in transit, the incredible harms that my co-panelists talked about that people are facing along the border, we're not very far from that. What we're doing right now is pretty close to that. So the question is, it's not just a one-sided question. We have the right to enforce our border. Well, at what cost, right? And we have the capability, we have the capacity, we have the resources to do this in a way that also recognizes the humanity of the people who are coming to our border. And that's what we should be aspiring to. That's what we should be doing as a nation. And asylum is not getting us there right now because of the transit problem. So those are my initial responses to those great thoughts and questions.
Guerline, did you want to jump in on the set of questions? And if not, I can definitely move on. Okay. So it also strikes me, so Jaya, thanks for touching on my second question about, how do we respond to people who want to justify and defend the system as it exists, or the kind of, the system as it exists on principled bases. I would say that there's also, and you see this whether you're reading the press, and I think this might be at play in some of the ways that the Biden administration has responded as well, is that even people who understand themselves to be kind of liberal defenders of human rights think that there's pragmatic problems here, right? So, okay, yes, we believe that we should have borders, that there should be limits on them, that, people are experiencing all of the suffering, but the idea is that the US just can't take everybody in. I know the ways in which I respond to those sorts of concerns, but I think it's helpful to hear how this panel responds to the idea that even for those who understand themselves to be progressives, what they understand is happening at the border presents very serious challenges that requires a kind of pausing and reflecting so we can have the appropriate measures that mean that we can have a sustainable system, part of which includes enforcing strong borders. So, and I think that's a little bit different from we have a right to exclude and we don't want those people to come, but the ultimate effect of both sentiments is doubling down, I think, on border enforcement policies that keep people out. Just curious to hear how you respond to those people. And this is not just you, Jaya, but anyone can jump in on this before we turn to ideals.
Professor Tindai, it's interesting when we talk about these things and then we think about these things, but the reality is the people who are the most impacted do not have the luxury to think about those things, because right now I need to escape because my life is in danger. I need to escape because of X, Y, and Z. The luxury that we have to discuss the lives of those people, they do not have. So you can see where at the very root of that is the inequity and inequality and the lack of value, right, for the lives of those people who are actually being impacted by the so-called borders that many people, even those who might think of themselves, I say think of themselves to be progressive, because if you are really, then you will understand that this is not a mindset to have. And so when we face the reality and we face what people are dealing with, and then we stand in our privilege and we decide for them, that is where we find ourselves as at a crossroad of inhumanity. When we are so privileged that we think it's okay to create those barrages, those mountains, so that we think we can dictate who deserves and who does not deserve. And I just posted a journey of hope, a report that Haitian Bridge Alliance released after the commemoration of the 11th anniversary of the earthquake. And we were so privileged and honored to have Professor Tindai write the forwards for that. And so I really invite you to take a look at that. And where we interviewed 30 women for whom that was not an option, that was not a privilege, that was a reality. So as we think of the system, of what can be, of how progressive we are in our ideas, then we will see we are far, far from being progressive. I'll stop here.
I want to respond to that, just kind of piggyback off of what Guerline was saying, because when people say, we can't let everyone in, or we don't have the capacity to let everyone in, I always want to ask why. What's going to happen? First of all, I'll just start with the reality at the border, right? We do have the capacity to process the people who are at the border right now and for asylum, period. Most of these people, almost all of them, have family members in the United States. They have a place to stay. They are willing to work if they can get a work permit. We don't even give them that at the outset. So the capacity kind of issues, I don't think are true. But even going beyond that, I think if people who have this idea of the border is there to protect me, then, really the question is from what, right? Like, what are you going to lose by having people come to this country? And I think it's really instructive to look at how immigrants who are in the United States are treated, right? So there's however 10, 12 million undocumented people who have very few rights. They're exploited in the labor system, and their labor is a direct contribution to our way of life in the United States. I'm not living in the US right now, but I'm still going to speak as a US citizen, like, farm labor, right? We can get all our cheap vegetables, or people who are exploited in the garment making industry, or whatever the case might be. Like, we are living our lifestyle because they're being exploited, right? So when we think about that on a global scale, what the border is doing is creating a segmented labor market to where we're getting cheap goods and can live a really great lifestyle, and other people don't even have enough to live a dignified lifestyle. They're starving, they're desperate, they can barely make ends meet. And so I really would want people who have this mindset of like, the border is protecting me from something, to really interrogate, like, what is it protecting you from? How are you benefiting from it? And if you think the way that you're benefiting from it is unjust or unethical, like, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I might just jump in, because I think it's a great question too. And I guess I have a couple of thoughts in response. So I think one question about whether we can bring all of these people in, I like to put the numbers of migrants at the border, right, in perspective by relating them to the percentage they are of the US population as a whole. And I haven't done this recently, but last time I looked about 5 years ago was 0.02% or some just infinitesimally small proportion of the US population. And also, we're a wealthy country. We can spend however many millions of dollars on a border wall. We can certainly spend the money needed to bring these people in to process them. I will say that what seems to really freak people out is psychologically is the image of all these people coming to the border. And right, I think it's a political ploy, right? I think that right, xenophobic politicians can take pictures of that and say, look, they're coming, they're invading. And we could actually get rid of all that by offering these people safe trip, right? We could offer these people the opportunity to get on an airplane for 1/10 of the amount that they're paying to get here, and they could come here, be reunited with their families, and we wouldn't have the whole spectacle that we have at the border, and that may alleviate some of that kind of moral panic anxiety that people feel. So my hope is that the Biden administration may be able to get us somewhere towards that goal, because I think it has benefits both to people at the border and right for kind of pragmatic policy reasons.
Thank you, all of you. And I think you've given a broad array of really important responses to a question that I think comes up and may not often be articulated, but exists in many people's mind. This idea that, well, you know, I care about doing the right thing, but they are just these pragmatic concerns that stand in the way. And I think highlighting both the capacity that the US has to effectively respond and also putting pressure on just what it means to be progressive and how far those ideals need to stretch if you're actually going to claim that terminology. And then Erica also highlighting the complicity of the US in benefiting from the way that borders are arranged right now, that in a way that actually challenges this idea of who the border protects, where and how. So I want to move us on to the next set of questions, but there is a Q&A question that I think fits in this section. There's two that fit in this section before we move on. One, we have Gabrielle Apollon who's asking, speaking of TPS, why is it that Haiti has not been redesignated for TPS in light of the State Department's travel advisory? So this is a question that this person puts to the panel. And then Veronica Overlid asks, and I think this was maybe addressed, but Jay, I want to give you an opportunity to reflect on it in case you want to. In respect to thinking about the Refugee Convention as having flaws or imperfections or being outdated, might it not just be that it reflects vested interests? And as I read the question, I realize you actually touched on this when you were saying the way that the convention was structured was for a completely different reality. But anyway, any thoughts on either of those before we move to the final set of questions?
I'll briefly touch on TPS and Jaya and Erica, please chime in. I'm sure you have some things to say. That's my question as well. Actually, that is what I would like for Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden to answer. As I have said before, we applaud President Biden and the administration for providing TPS for our Venezuelan brothers and sisters, over 300,000 of them. Also for Burma, amazing. We've been fighting for those countries, and redesignation of TPS for Syria. And we are thrilled. We are ecstatic that this happened. But now we are asking, where's Haiti? Where is Haiti while literally he is in a state of complete uprising? There's violence. They are asking for the president to leave. The president is refusing to leave. There is literally a country in flames. Yet, after close to 100 days, we have yet to see TPS for Haiti. We do understand there's a lot of things at play, but if they could do TPS for Venezuela, if they could do TPS for Syria, if they could redesignate TPS for Syria, we need to know why Haiti is still not being redesignated. That is what we need to ask of the government. Because when we look at all of those different points, we cannot understand why we still have to fight, why we still need to ask. How can we not account anti-Black racism as a part of the system? How can we not have to continue to scream immigration is a Black issue when, while Haiti is on fire, under President Biden, 32 flights, 32 deportation and expulsion flights to Haiti, yet they refuse to redesignate TPS for Haiti. So this is a racial justice issue. It is an anti-Black issue. It is Haiti daring to be Haiti and still cannot get protection when protection is needed. So we need that answer from our government. We need that answer from President Biden, from Vice President Harris, from Secretary Mayorkas, from all of our administration. We need that answer from them.
I just wanted to jump in really quick and just say something about TPS because I had the great honor of working with the Central American community over the past 20 years, but particularly when I was at Cartagena in Los Angeles, had a lot of clients with TPS. We did all the TPS renewals. It is like the bare minimum, right? Like you get a work permit, you have to renew it every 18 months, and you cannot petition for your family. So we have people in the United States who've had TPS for like 20 years, and they're just in this liminal status where, you know, it could be taken away from them at any time. And I will say that at that job, I also worked with unaccompanied children. So many of them had parents with TPS in the United States, right? And so basically you're looking at a situation where the parent could get protection and they're probably sending money home, but because the kid was alone in Central America, they were so at risk that they took that very dangerous journey to the border on their own. So when I just want to put TPS in that perspective, because when we're asking for this, we're asking for crumbs, right? And the fact that they're not even giving us crumbs is an indictment on this administration.
So I want to move us on to the final set of questions, or the second to final set of questions for our panel. And I want to thank you all for, I think, giving us really powerful critiques and understanding of the flaws and the problems and the injustices that inhere in the existing system, as well as enforcement. But I'd like to ask you each to think about what it would mean to move towards a more just and humane system. And I'd invite you to think about that at multiple levels, in terms of the kind of ideal, what would the ideals look like? Thinking big, even if it's hard to think about what the steps would be to get there. And then also invite you to reflect on the question in a more kind of medium to short term. What steps do you think could be taken in the next few days? And of course, these things are connected when we think about how we move from the present to the future. But what would it take to get to a more just and humane system? And we have two questions from the audience that I think fit nicely here. One from advocates, so individual advocates, lawyers, and people working in different fields. What might they do to help move us towards that? And then I have a law student who's someone who's about to start law school and is thinking specifically about what law students can do to move us towards a more just asylum system. So that's the first set of questions. And then we'll come and talk about the Biden administration specifically before we close. So Erica, do you want to start us off in terms of what you think it would take to move towards a more just and humane system?
Yeah, so this is such a huge question, but I think fundamentally people should have the right to move. They should have the right to do so in a dignified manner. And you should have basic rights when you migrate, right? So I've always been struck by the obsession the US has with representative democracy and the fact that we allow millions upon millions of people to live in our country for sometimes most of their lives without having any of those rights of representation. And so I think an ideal system would really require really rethinking what citizenship means, not just migration, right? Because you can migrate and then be like in a, guest laborer situation in Saudi Arabia or something, right? Like that's not necessarily in the migrants' best interest. Maybe it's better than like starving to death, but it's not good, right? So I think, when we think about an ideal system, it's not just the right to migrate. It's like, what happens once you do that? Do you have labor protections? Do you have access to education? Do you have access to health? Do you have the power to choose the representatives who make the laws that affect your life, right? And that's such a fundamental right that Americans hold dear. And it really disturbs me that we don't think that migrants should have that right because of citizenship, right? So yeah, that's the ideal world for me. Like I wish we didn't have to have the asylum system. I wish people could just move in that way. I do think it is a necessary step right now. There's a couple concrete things that I think could get us there. So immediately it's about harm reduction. So ending Title 42 is top of my mind. For asylum seekers, just being processed on arrival when you get to the port of entry, not being detained. I think immigration detention should be abolished, as should CBP. It cannot be reformed. It's a militarized agency. It's a rogue agency that does not answer to Congress or the courts. And I can tell you that from a lot of experience of suing them and just having them do whatever they want after the judge's order or after a congressional inquiry. And then just also like, expanding TPS in the short term, letting people with TPS petition their family members or adjust their own status, expanding H-2B labor visas for, people who might not necessarily want to go through the asylum system. So there are all these like kind of steps we can take. And just to end, this portion of my answer, I feel personally like we're so far from what I think is the ideal that I probably won't see it in my lifetime. What I feel my purpose is now is to just hold back fascism, because especially during the last administration, it was frightening how close we got to it. And, I really see my job as preserving the few rights that exist and trying to, make policy changes and legal changes to alleviate immediate suffering, so that's where I'm talking about things like TPS and ending Title 42, but that's not a solution, right? And I think the solution is going to take a generational shift of perspective. And I have so much hope in young people, especially seeing the abolitionist movements, especially this past summer. It's hard to even know what year it is, 2020 summer, but even continuing, right? Like when I saw that, I had hope for the immigration system, because those abolitionist concepts are so important for both. But I think as an immigration practitioner, like we're not going to even get there until we address the anti-Blackness in the immigration system. So we have so much work to do, but I'm probably going to be too old to do it by the time we get close to the ideal, but I hope that our children and their children will get there.
Yes, absolutely. Everything Erica says 1,000 times. I remember in 2017, a group of people, who wanted to see change, and we were imagining what will an ideal world be when it comes to immigration. And I don't even know what year we are now with everything that's been going on. It seems like yesterday, yet now I'm thinking 2017 was a very long time ago. And after 3 years of going back and forth as to, ideas and what's not, and, everybody came back to very simple ideas, the freedom to move, the freedom to thrive when you move from one place to another, the freedom to just be LGBTQA plus I transgender, to just be who you are, the freedom to be Black, the freedom where we no longer understand, even as a US citizen, if you are a Black woman, a Black man, your life does not matter. The freedom for you to exist, the freedom to not have a system that literally encloses people into a false reality, the freedom to move, to thrive, to be, to exist. That's what we envision. That's what I continue to envision. But the reality is, as we think about MLK and Rosa Parks and all of those people who came before us, it is outrageous for us to continue to march and say, I have a dream. So for me, it's like the reality, what I would love to see is the same reality that my parents wanted to see. And it's the reality I do not want my daughter to be in.
Thank you so much. Those are both hard acts to follow, but I will say that my number one answer to that is the same as Erica's and Guerline's, which is free movement. And free movement, it may sound like a wacky academic-y idea, but we have free movement regimes. We have the most well-known one is in the European Union. We also have a free movement regime in Mercosur in South America that was set up, and probably when it set up, the Venezuelans thought they were going to get a lot of folks coming in from other countries. And now it turns out that's what Venezuelans are using to move to Colombia and other countries. And now I won't say the system is perfect, but that's, that is a model to look at of where we might want to go, because it enables people not to have to go through the traumas that Erica described that our asylum system perpetrates on people, but actually just to get up and move to another country where they can work, they can stay, they can send their kids to school, right? They can be treated with some dignity. It's a possibility. And again, thinking of what we owe our neighbors, right? That's something that I in terms of long-term vision, I think that's really where I would like to see us to go. In the short term, I just want to hammer one more time my dead horse, which is safe transit. We just really have to work on safe transit. It's just unacceptable what we're doing to people, and that needs to be a priority. That requires, that I guess goes hand in hand with kind of work within the region. And when I'm talking about work within the region, I'm talking about actual assistance. I'm talking not containment strategies, right? I'm talking about helping folks, as Guerline, talked about her friend or client who didn't want to leave Haiti, right? There are plenty of people who don't want to leave and who would rather stay. And so making it possible for them to stay at home if they want to stay, and making it possible for them if they want to move in dignity and in safety. That doesn't sound like too much to ask for when we're talking about human beings.
Thanks, Jaya. And, listening to the three of you makes me feel the most hopeful I've felt about many of these things in a really long time. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to just make a comment about free movement. I feel like the people who have the hardest time imagining free movement tend to be also people who have just about as close as you can get to free movement, right? People with very powerful passports, such as US passports, who can travel visa-free or easily get a visa to go to much of the world. So I think it's important to push back on the impossibility of free movement when we begin to think about the way that existing regimes actually give free movement to some, including those that are most opposed to it. And honestly, the people who are most, I think, invested in free movement and who can see it as a reality are those who are most constrained to move, and so I think it's always important to keep in sight who moves, how, and how the barriers are often set up on a racial, gendered, kind of class and citizenship basis. So for our final question, I think one thing that you can say about the Trump administration is that they really laid bare the kind of white supremacist settler colonial core of the borders of the United States, and maybe even turbocharged that white supremacy in ways that I think made vivid problems that have been buried, or maybe even not so buried, in borders for a very long time. And I think one of the things that resulted from that is that as that whole regime was laid bare, there were ways of thinking about borders that became articulated in public spaces in ways that I think were not the case before. So Erica, one of your, I think, concrete recommendations was the abolition of CBP, right? The abolition of ICE. And there was a time not that long ago when that kind of statement would have just kind of seemed like, what are you even talking about? Whereas I think that's actually a concrete policy recommendation we can all agree that isn't for a future time, but that could be implemented, in the foreseeable future. And I don't think that just says something about me, but I think it's actually the case. So, even if we cannot achieve the utopian kind of ideals that we desire and the long-term goals, I think there's something to be said for the ways in which we are in a moment where reforms or, remakings that may have seemed unthinkable in the past are actually things that have traction and could have political traction. So I guess this is a long lead up to say, what are your kind of desiderata from the Biden administration? Things that if you could say to them, this is what you need to do, this is what the list looks like. And we're almost out of time, but Erica, you started us off with a really great list. So maybe Guerline, I'll have you maybe give us a list of 2 or 3 or 4 things that you would like to see the Biden administration do as soon as possible.
Yes, thank you so much. Again, Erica laid it out, but we did send a list of things that we needed the administration to do, and that includes many of what Erica mentioned, and that also include a pathway to citizenship. I don't like to say pathway to citizenship, but I like to say to permanent residency, and if the person so choose to become a citizen, that they can do that. Protection for the children, the DACA, the TPS, now that we always knew that immigrants were essential, but with the reality with COVID-19, we understand we understand the power behind those TPS holders, like Rose, who is a nurse practitioner who got COVID and continued to put her life and her entire family at risk because she wanted to make sure that these United States of ours stayed healthy. We want to make sure that a family reunification is enacted. We want to make sure that Title 42 is immediately rescinded. We want to make sure that we welcome people with dignity. These are a few of the different things that we know that they can do yesterday, not tomorrow, that they could do yesterday. So these are concrete steps we want to see them do as we continue to fight and create a better world, not a better system, a better world. And as we see President Biden during the campaign, he said he wanted to build back better. We want him to build better, period. Because for a lot of us, there is no place for us to build back from. We also run on the fact of saving the soul of America. That is what we need him to do. And by doing that, including, as I mentioned, everything that Erica said, everything that Jaya will say, Title 42 rescinded, stop deportation and expulsion, make sure we provide protection for those who are the most vulnerable, redesignate TPS for Haiti immediately along with other countries, provide a pathway to permanent citizenship for those 11 million people, allow people to be reunited with their families, and create a pathway to welcome people with dignity. I will stop here.
Erica and then Jaya.
Well, I gave my little list earlier, but I know we're almost out of time, but just one last thing. The Biden administration has not reunified any of the families separated under Trump as of today. Our first reunifications will be on Tuesday. So that's exciting, but it wasn't like they brought people back. My organization is bringing them to the border and they are letting them in. So there is a huge gulf between the rhetoric and the reality of this administration. I came in still pretty cynical, but maybe with more hope that I have now, because I see this like just deterrence mindset in how this administration is approaching immigration policy. But I hope that we can get some of our lists, but especially hoping that not only the families separated under Trump could be reunified, but all of the families that have been separated by unjust U.S. immigration policies, including the folks who've been deported. So.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I just have a couple of thoughts. The first is that we just really need, as Munir Ahmad said this morning, we really need some political courage. I might have chosen a different word starting with C that's in Spanish, but not appropriate for this crowd, perhaps.
Say it for you.
we need someone to stand up and provide a really full-throated moral response to anti-immigrant screeds, to the xenophobia that we're seeing. We need a reminder of who we are as a nation. We need someone to change the conversation, and we don't get anywhere by parroting the anti-immigration tropes. That's not taking us anywhere. And one of the things I've been looking at recently is the polling data around refugee resettlement, which has never in history been popular. But what happened is we had politicians with courage who knew it was the right thing to do, who made it happen. And that's really what we need to see today. We need to start talking about humanity and American values. We need, as we said before, a shift in the enforcement culture. That's going to be really, really, really hard work. But this enforcement militarization culture has to end. And I just wanted to end on 2 points, because I think we didn't touch on the great questions Tendai asked in the last round about what advocates can do and what law students can do. I think really what actually both can do, but maybe the first one's for advocate, is education, right? To help dismantle the racist depictions of immigrants, understand why people are actually moving, and what we can do to help, and how many resources we have to support and protect them. Part of the reason I circulated that link to Erica and Guerline's report earlier is I feel like people would be outraged if everyday Americans read this. People were outraged when we saw family separations at the border, right? And so getting the word out, right, I have to hope would make a difference. Now, this is a big ask, right? Dismantling structural racism that's been around for 400 years, but I think we need to do that. And we also need to do the work within our own communities. So I used to have a demographics or inevitable answer to this problem, maybe not so much after the last election. So we need to be doing the work in our own communities to raise awareness about what needs to happen. But the students give me hope every single day. My students are just burning the house down, and that's what law students can do. You can burn this house down, right? You can go out there with these beliefs and make change, and that's the only thing that's gonna save us. And I just wanted to end with a huge thank you to the center. I think Hiroshi should be recognized for all that he's done for the immigration law professors community. He made us a community where from what I've heard, in the early days, there was no community, and he's welcomed generations of us. Start to get emotional here. And to have Ahilan working with him is just so incredibly exciting. That's what we have, and that's what I've seen throughout this conference so far is, we're fighting incredible injustice, but we have community, and watching the infiltrators and seeing everyone talk, we have this incredible community around us, and that's what keeps us all going. And so that's what the advocates do, that's what the law students do, that's what Hiroshi has done for so many years. And I'm really excited to see what the center does in terms of building all of these communities. Thank you for bringing us all together for this wonderful conversation today.
Thanks, Jaya. Guerline, there's a request for the report that you mentioned, A Journey of Hope. If you could just put a link to that in the chat, that would be wonderful. And it just remains for me to thank all three of our panelists. Jay, I think your tears are appropriate. It's been very moving to share the space with the three of you, and I look forward to the community that Hiroshi and Ahilan are going to continue to build beyond this conference. But thank you so much for your powerful and insightful remarks, and I'm going to turn it over to Hiroshi.
Wow, it's thank you, Jaya, but thank you to all of the panel. I mean, this is I just want to keep listening, actually. Yeah, it's this is one of the things we want to create at the center. Really, is the continuation of community. I can think back to years when the community was much smaller, but it was also, I think, less integrated. That is to say, in the sense of the academy and activism and communities and lawyers and integrated in that sense of really working together. So that's one of the things that we hope to do in the center. This has been such a thought-provoking, provocative, bold panel. Gives us so much to think about, so much to act on. And really thanks to everyone here today for your engagement and your attention. I mean, it's been such a successful day too that I think we should have a day 3, and that's going to be next Friday. I just want to give you like a quick preview of this without delaying adjournment too long. But again, we're going to have panels that combine what we hope is just a different set of perspectives, really from grassroots community organizations, Washington, D.C., the academy, organizing, lawyering. And so the first panel is going to be about building power during the Biden administration. It's really about advocacy, and in particular, inside advocacy, outside advocacy, the whole idea that they're folks who I think would self-identify as immigrant rights advocates who are in the administration now inside, but people outside advocacy. So that's the morning. Midday is going to be my conversation with Senator Alex Padilla. Senator Padilla not only represents California in the U.S. Senate, but he's also a former elected statewide official in California. And now in the Senate, he's the chair of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety. So he's in a position to be the legislative person at the tiller or at the helm, whatever metaphor you want to use to see exactly what Congress is going to do. So I look forward to talking to him about a lot of issues that I think are going to be on the minds of not just me, but also a lot of people in the audience in the same way that Ayhan engaged with Secretary Mayorkas today. And then in the afternoon, we're going to have a panel that may build a bit on what Senator Padilla talks about, which is a panel called Congress, the President, and Legal Status. Who should do what and when? It's really about TPS, DACA, legalization, amnesty, different words, different programs, but really the idea of, is it Congress? Is it for Congress? What if Congress doesn't act in the way that a lot of people want? What is there for the administration to do? What is the possibility, both politically and legally? So I should remind you that the registration for next Friday for day 3 of our 3-day conference is a separate registration with a separate link. But I hope to see you all there in a week. And in the meantime, have a great weekend. Have a great week. Thanks.